The first thing the veil took from us was the sky. I watched it happen from the gantry of Rig St. 11, 200 kilometers off what used to be the Alaskan shelf, when the clouds above the platform began to braid themselves into shapes no weather had ever made. Spirals tightening, edges that cut, a slow, patient geometry, like something thinking out loud. My coffee was still warm in my hand. I remember that more clearly than I remember the alarms. Eric saw it before I did. He always did. He had the kind of eyes that read a room the way other men read a book, and he turned to me on the catwalk with his mouth open around a word he never finished. The wind took it. The wind took a lot of things that morning. "Kate," he said when the sound came back. "Kate, get inside." I didn't move. I was a reporter. I had spent 4 years getting onto that rig, and I wasn't going to spend the last clean minute of my life looking at a wall. So I stood there with the gantry shaking under my boots, and I watched the Veil's first seed touch the ocean. It didn't fall. That's the part I keep coming back to. It didn't fall the way debris falls, or fire, or even rain. It chose. It picked a spot 200 meters off the southwest leg of the rig, and it lowered itself down like a hand, setting a glass on a table. When it met the water stopped being water. Not boiled, not vaporized, just stopped. A circle of ocean the size of a city block went the gray of a dead screen and then went up, all at once, into the braided sky. That was the first time I heard the sound humans would come to call the lullaby. A long, low note, almost gentle. The kind of sound you might mistake for your own pulse if you were tired enough. The kind of sound a parent makes hushing a child. Eric grabbed my wrist hard enough to bruise. Move. We moved. I don't remember the helicopter. I remember Eric's hand on the back of my neck pushing my head down. And I remember the rotor wash whipping his jacket open so I could see the ID badge clipped to his shirt. The one he had laminated himself because the company never bothered. And I remember that the badge had a smear of my coffee on it. The mug had broken somewhere on the stairs. He had caught me when I slipped. The rig was gone before we cleared the perimeter. Not collapsed. Unmade. The legs stood there in the water for a full 8 seconds after the deck had ceased to exist. And then they too were gone. Dissolved into the same gray nothing that had taken the sea. Eric was screaming into the headset. Coordinates. A name I didn't catch. The pilot was a kid, maybe 22, and his hands on the stick were shaking so hard that the horizon outside the canopy looked like a heartbeat. I held the data card in my fist until the plastic edge cut my palm. I didn't know yet what was on it. I knew only that Eric had pressed it into my hand on the gantry and said 3 words. "They lied, Kate." He didn't say who. He didn't have to. There is only ever one they when a corporation builds a thing in the dark and calls it safe. We were 40 minutes out when the second seed dropped. The pilot saw it first this time and banked so hard I felt my ribs separate from the harness. Behind us, the ocean opened a second gray mouth and sang its lullaby into the upper atmosphere, and the clouds began to braid faster. And somewhere in my chest, a thing I had not yet learned to name started to count. Eric did not make it to shore. The third seed found us before the coast did. I will not write what I saw. I have written it 1,000 times in my head, and every version is a lie. What I will write is this. He pushed me into the survival pod, and he did not get in after me, and the last thing he said was not anything noble. He said, "Tell your mother I'm sorry about the lamp, because once, 10 years ago at a Thanksgiving I barely remember, he had broken a lamp in my mother's hallway and never apologized properly, and it had been a joke between us ever since." He said it grinning. He said it like a man finishing a sentence he had started a long time before. Then the pod door sealed, and the sea took him, and I went down into the dark with the data card in my fist, and a sound in my ears that was not quite the lullaby and not quite my own crying. They came for us officially 3 days later. By then the news already had a name for them. The Veil. Nobody knew where the word came from. It surfaced the way certain words do in a crisis, found in 1,000 mouths at once, with no clear first speaker, as if the species itself had whispered the syllable into our sleep. I watched the first contact broadcast from the back of a diner in Anchorage, with a hood pulled low and a cup of coffee I could not bring myself to drink. The screen above the counter showed a thing I had no language for. Not a ship, a shape. Folded and unfolding, the way origami unfolds when you tug the corner, except the paper was the size of a moon, and the corner was tugged from somewhere we could not see. Their envoy spoke through our own satellites. They had reached down and taken the satellites the way a child takes a toy off a shelf. And they used them to speak, and the voice that came out was beautiful. That is the cruelest thing I can tell you about the Veil. Their voice was beautiful. It sounded like every language at once, and none of them like a chord you almost recognize. "We have come," the voice said, "to compose." That was the word, compose. Their seeds were not weapons, the envoy explained, with the patience of a teacher addressing a slow room. Their seeds were instruments. Earth, the envoy explained, was an instrument too. A rough one, untuned, played badly by its own surface life for far too long. The veil had come to tune it, to make of it something that could finally be heard properly across the dark. The dissolution of our cities, the gray mouths in our oceans, the braided sky. These were not destruction. These were the warming of the bow. The waitress behind the counter set down a plate she had been holding. It cracked on the linoleum. Nobody moved to pick it up. I felt the data card in my jacket pocket. I felt my palm where it had healed crooked over the cut. I felt the absence of my friend the way you feel a tooth that isn't there anymore, the tongue going back and back to the gap. I left money on the table, and I walked out into a country that did not yet know it was already an instrument being tuned. Nathan McCain found me, not the other way around. I want to say that for the record, because in the version of this story that gets told at school assemblies after everything, I am made into someone who knew what she was doing, and I did not. I was a reporter on the run from a company whose CEO had decided that the cleanest way to bury a leaked nanotech program was to bury the reporter who had it. I had not slept in 9 days. I smelled like a bus station. Nathan walked up to me in the rain outside a Greyhound terminal in Spokane, and he said, "You're Catherine Stern. I read your piece on the Yucca shipments. Please don't run. I'm not with anyone." He had a graduate student's beard and the wrong kind of coat for the weather, and a paper bag full of cold dumplings he had bought for himself and then forgotten to eat. He gave me half. He did not ask for the card. He asked instead what the sound had been like, the lullaby. He had a theory. He wanted to know if I would tell him. I told him. We sat on a bus station bench under a sodium lamp that was failing in slow yellow pulses, and I told him about the gantry and the gray and the song. And he listened with his whole face the way only certain men ever listen. And when I was done, he said, very quietly, "They're not tuning us. They're rewriting us. The seeds are not instruments. The seeds are quills." I asked him what he meant. He said, "They're nanomachines, ours, or based on ours. The same architecture the StarCorp leak put into the stratosphere. The Vel found it. They liked it. They are using it." I felt the bench under me become a long way down. They didn't invade with weapons, Catherine. They invaded with our own mistake. We handed them the pen. They're just writing in our margins. I sat very still on the bench. The sodium lamp pulsed yellow over us, off yellow again, and in the off second I could see his face the way I would later learn to read it, every flinch and pause and small tell. He was younger than me by maybe 6 years. He had cracked knuckles and a smell of cheap soap and chalk dust, and a stain on his coat that I would, 2 months later, learn was from the chemical fire he had set in a Berkeley lab the day he stole the equipment we now needed. "How long have you been carrying this?" I said. 3 weeks. "Why me?" He looked down at the dumplings. "Because you wrote the Yucca piece. Because you put your name on it. Most people, when they figure out what they figured out, they sit on it. They want a committee. They want someone to tell them it's all right to be afraid. You didn't wait for the committee." I laughed once without any humor in it. "I'm waiting for one now." "No," he said. He looked at me. He had the kind of eyes that did not flinch when they should have. "You're not. You're just tired. There's a difference." I drank the rest of his coffee. It was bad coffee. I have never tasted anything better. 3 blocks from the bus station, in a hardware store that was already half empty, because the owner had driven south with his family the night before, Nathan bought a roll of copper wire, a soldering iron, a set of jeweler's screwdrivers, and a child's plastic snow globe with a tiny plastic moose inside. He paid in cash. He gave the moose to me when we got back to his car and said, without smiling, that I should keep it because we were going to need a small piece of the old world on the dashboard, something that had been made before any of this, something the veal could not have read first. I put the moose on the dashboard. It stayed there the whole way west. The hard rule of the Vive, we learned, was patience. They did not blitz our cities. They did not march. They sang. They lowered their seeds, one by one, at intervals that made no military sense and perfect musical sense, and each seed reshaped a patch of the world into something useful to them and uninhabitable to us. A forest became a humming lattice. A city became a slow-spreading mirror. The Pacific grew a chord. Our maps stopped meaning anything. The braided sky widened. And every 26 hours, somewhere on the planet, the lullaby played. and 100,000 people who had been alive went quiet inside it. And the Veil's voice came down through the hijacked satellites and said, with that same beautiful patience, "Be still. You are becoming music." Colonel Thomas Miller was the first man I met who refused to be still. He found us through Nathan. Old service contact, old debt, the kind of network that survives because it was built before there were satellites to hijack. He came to the safe house in a borrowed pickup with a busted tail light and a duffel of paper maps, because paper still worked when nothing else did. He was 60 if he was a day. His hair was cut so short you could see the shape of his skull, and his eyes were the gray of a deck plate in winter. And when he shook my hand, he did it with both of his, the way men shake hands at funerals. "Miss Stern," he said, "I am sorry about your friend." I did not cry. I had not cried since the pod. I was waiting for permission, and the colonel was not in the business of giving it. He laid the maps out on the kitchen table. He showed us the pattern of the seeds. He had been the only senior officer who had bothered to chart them by hand, because the digital systems kept losing them, kept smoothing them out, kept calling the gray mouths weather. The pattern, when you saw it on paper, was a spiral, a long, lazy spiral that was tightening week by week on a single point in the upper Pacific, a latitude and a longitude, a center. "They're tuning the planet to that note," he said. "Whatever they're going to play, they're going to play it from there." Nathan stared at the maps a long time. Then he said the thing that would, in the end, kill all three of us almost and one of us fully. He said, "If it's a song, it can be broken." The colonel looked at him, really looked. The way a man looks at a tool he has just realized he has been carrying around in his pocket. "How?" he said. Nathan tapped the data card. The one Eric had pressed into my fist on the gantry 200 kilometers off a coast that no longer existed. The card I had not in 9 weeks opened. "With our pen," he said, "back in their margin. Here is what was on the card." The StarkCorp leak had not been an accident. The CEO, a man named Stark, whose face I had once put on the cover of a magazine, had been selling the architecture, quietly, to a buyer he did not understand. The buyer had paid in math the StarkCorp engineers could not parse, and Stark had taken the math because it ran his stock price up, and one of his junior engineers, a man named Eric Lambry, who broke lamps and laughed about it and pushed reporters into survival pods, had seen the math and recognized something inside it that no human had put there. A signature, a grammar, a hand. The Veil had been writing to us for a long time before they came. Eric had read the letter. Eric had copied it. Eric had given it to me. Nathan spent 4 days inside that card and came out the other side gray-faced and quieter than I had ever known him. He looked at me across the kitchen table and he said, "Catherine, I can answer it. I can write back. But I need to put the answer where they will read it. And the only place they will read it is in the center of the spiral." The colonel said, without looking up from his maps, "Then we go to the center of the spiral." I said nothing for a long minute. Then I said, "Eric would have come." The colonel looked at me then. He said, "I know. That's why you're coming, because he would have." We crossed a country that was no longer a country. The cities we passed had been partly composed. Whole districts hummed in keys you could feel in your sternum. We drove through a stretch of Wyoming where the road had become a soft singing thing, and the truck's tires lifted slightly with every revolution, as if the asphalt were trying to teach itself to be a string. We did not stop. We did not look long. The colonel kept his eyes on the road and his jaw set, and one hand always near the dash where a small, ugly device of Nathan's making sat blinking, a little homemade thing wrapped in electrical tape that, Nathan swore, would scramble the seeds' local listening if they passed too close. There were people, too. That is the part the news did not cover well, because the cameras had stopped working in the composed zones, and because the people who were still themselves did not want to be photographed. We passed a gas station outside Rock Springs, where a family of 4 was sitting at a picnic table in the parking lot, all 4 of them eating from the same can of peaches with the same slow, identical rhythm, lifting the spoon and lowering it in a tempo I could feel through the floor of the truck. They watched us go by. They smiled. They smiled in time. The colonel did not slow down. Outside Pocatello, we found a man walking along the shoulder of the highway with no shoes on. He was old, maybe 70, wearing a flannel shirt and a wedding ring and nothing in his hands. The colonel pulled over. The man came to the window. He was humming. He was humming the lullaby, low and tuneless, and his eyes were the soft, pleased eyes of a child who has just heard a good joke. The colonel asked him where he was going. The man said, "Toward the music." The colonel asked him if he wanted a ride. The man said, "No, thank you. I'm enjoying the walk." Then he smiled, in time, and kept walking. We drove on. None of us spoke for an hour. Nathan worked the whole way. He worked in the passenger seat with the laptop on his knees and the card in a slot he had soldered into the side of it, and his fingers moved over the keys the way a pianist's fingers move when he has gone past thinking and into the place where the hands know on their own. Sometimes he muttered. Sometimes he laughed, a small, startled, unhappy laugh, the laugh of a man finding that the math he had been afraid of was uglier than he had hoped. Once, near Twin Falls, he turned to me and said, "Their grammar is recursive, Kate. Every sentence they write contains the whole sentence again, smaller, all the way down. It's why the seeds keep working after they've landed. The seed is a sentence that keeps saying itself." I said, "Can you write a sentence that says itself the other way?" He stared at me for a long time. Then he turned back to the laptop and he typed faster. It worked, mostly. Twice it did not, and twice we sat very still in the cab with the lullaby coming down through the windshield and the Colonel humming just under his breath, a tune I did not recognize until the third night. It was a hymn his mother had sung to him. He told me on the third night, sitting on the tailgate while Nathan slept in the cab, that his mother had been a Welsh chapel singer with a voice like a knife wrapped in velvet, and that when he was a boy with a fever, she had sat by his bed and sung this same hymn over and over because she believed, with the whole of her flat Methodist heart, that a tune could keep a thing out of a child if you sang it long enough. "I don't believe that," he said. "I never did." He took a pull from a flask. He passed it to me. I took a pull. It tasted like turpentine and home. "But I sing it anyway," he said, "because she did. And because every time I sing it, the seeds don't hear me. Maybe they hear her instead. Maybe she's louder than them, where it counts." I passed the flask back. I did not say anything. I did not have to. Some things you just sit beside. The veal noticed us at the Idaho line. We knew because the sky above the truck stopped braiding for a moment. It held very still, the way a cat holds still before it pounces, and then a single seed began to lower itself, slow and patient, exactly the way the first one had lowered itself onto the sea off St. Eleven. The Colonel did not slow down. He sped up. Nathan was in the back seat with the card and a laptop wired to 3 batteries and a coil of copper he had stolen from a hardware store in Boise. And he was typing the way a man types who has remembered, finally, how a piano works. I said, "Colonel," he said, "I see it." The seed came down. The truck's hood began to gray at the edges. I felt my own hair lift, as if the air itself were trying to lift me out of my body. The lullaby started, soft, almost shy. The Colonel began to sing his mother's hymn. He sang it loud and badly, a bad Welsh tune in a bad American voice in a bad truck on a bad road. He sang it with his teeth bared and his hands white on the wheel and the seed 3 meters above our roof. And I will tell you what happened next as plainly as I can, because nobody will believe it anyway. The seed paused. It paused. A thing the size of a small barn, lowered out of the sky by a species that had unmade an ocean, paused above a pickup truck because a 60-year-old colonel was singing a hymn his mother had taught him in a kitchen in Cardiff 60 years ago. Nathan, in the back, did not look up from his laptop. He said, very calmly,
"Keep singing, sir."
The Colonel kept singing. I joined him. I did not know the words. I sang the shape of them. Nathan typed. The card, plugged into the laptop, lit up with a small green light, and Nathan exhaled through his teeth and said, "I have their attention. Drive." The Colonel drove. We did not stop singing until the seed was a dot in the mirror and the gray on the hood had begun, very slowly, to flake off in the wind like ash. I asked Nathan later what he had done. He said, "I didn't do anything yet. I just knocked on the door." He smiled when he said it. It was the first time I had seen him smile in 3 weeks. They opened it. The center of the spiral was a hole in the Pacific, but there was a thing we had to do first. 3 days out from the coast in a borrowed house in the hills above what used to be Tacoma. The Colonel sat me down at a kitchen table and slid a manila folder across the wood. Inside was a photograph of Stark, Roy Stark, the CEO. The man whose handshake had once gotten him onto the cover of the magazine I had worked for. The man whose engineers had sold a grammar to a sky that we now had to write back to. The photograph was recent. He was alive. He was on a private airstrip outside Vancouver, supervising the loading of a jet that, the Colonel's old contacts had confirmed, was preparing to carry him and a sample of unreacted nanomachines to a buyer in Shanghai. "You wanted the story, Miss Stern," the Colonel said. "Here's the rest of it." I looked at the photograph for a long time. I thought about Eric on the gantry. I thought about the coffee on his ID badge. I thought about a man who had sold our pen to the dark and was now about to sell another pen to another buyer because the first sale had paid out. I said, "Are you offering me a gun, Colonel?" He said, "No, ma'am, I'm offering you a recorder." He slid a second thing across the table, a small black device. He said, "Roy Stark has spent 11 weeks watching his sky come apart and his stock go to zero and his lawyers stop returning his calls. He is alone in a hangar with a jet that nobody is going to let him board. He will talk to a reporter. He will talk to you because you are the last person on Earth who he can still try to lie to. We need that lie on tape. We need the world to hear who handed the pen over. Otherwise, when this is done, when we are done, somebody else with his face is going to do it again." I took the recorder. The hangar was cold. There were no guards. There was a jet that was never going to take off and a man in a $5,000 coat sitting on a folding chair beside the wheel, drinking from a paper cup. He looked up when I came in. He recognized me. He laughed, a short, broken laugh, the laugh of a man who has been waiting a long time for the worst possible visitor and is almost relieved that she has finally come. "Catherine Stern," he said. "Come to write the obituary." "No," I said. "Come to write the confession." I turned the recorder on. He talked for an hour. He talked the way men like him always talk in the end, with a kind of giddy, contemptuous honesty, as if explaining the trick to a child. He had known. Of course he had known. He had not understood, but he had known enough to know that what he was selling was not his to sell. And he had taken the math anyway, and he had buried the engineer who flagged it. And when that engineer's friend on a rig off Alaska had started asking the wrong questions, he had not warned the rig. He had not warned Eric. He had let the seeds go because the seeds going meant his contract closed. He told me this with a paper cup in his hand and his coat too big for him and a runway behind him that nobody was ever going to clear. When he was done, I turned the recorder off. He looked at me. He said, "What now, Miss Stern?" I said, "Now I leave." He said, "That's it?" I said, "You sold the species, Mr. Stark. The species is going to deal with you. I'm just the one writing it down." I walked out of the hangar. I did not look back. I heard, behind me, the small sound of a paper cup being set down on concrete, and then nothing else. I have wondered over the years what he did with the rest of that night. I have not wondered hard. Some men, when the door closes behind the last person who will ever listen to them, find their own way to be still. I gave the tape to the colonel. The colonel gave it to a friend at a newspaper that, by morning, had wired the file to 12 other newspapers in 7 other countries, and by the time we boarded the Icarus, the world knew finally, in a single human handwriting, whose hand had passed the pen. It mattered. I want to say that now, while I am writing this. It mattered to know. It mattered to all of us who, in the weeks that followed, did what we did because we had finally been told the truth about what had been done. It is harder to be still when you are angry. The Veal, in the end, did not understand that about us either. The Pacific, the whole, the shape we could not look at directly, that is the only honest word for it, a whole. The Veil had unmade a circle of ocean 200 kilometers wide, and they had let the sky come down to fill it, and the sky had filled it. And now the sky and the sea had become one slow gray rotation, and at the center of the rotation was a shape we could not look at directly. The eye made decisions about the shape that the eye refused to share with the brain. You looked at it, and you forgot the looking. You looked again, and you forgot again. The colonel had gotten us onto a stolen Navy aircraft because the colonel was the kind of man who could, when sufficiently angry, get a person onto a stolen Navy aircraft. We came in low. The aircraft was called Icarus, which was somebody's idea of a joke a long time ago. It had an EMP package in its belly the size of a Volkswagen and a flight crew of 3 who had agreed, without ever quite saying so, that this was not a flight they would be coming back from. Nathan sat in the back with the card and the laptop and a face the color of paper. He had finished writing. He had been writing the whole drive west and the whole flight out from a runway that no longer officially existed. And now he was done, and his hands were shaking. And he looked at me and he said, "Catherine, I'm going to send it when we cross the inner ring. The EMP will carry it. The seeds will read it. They will read all of it." I said, "What does it say?" He said, "It says we're not an instrument." He smiled the small smile again, the shy one, the graduate student one. "It says we're a writer. The Veal came up to meet us. They came up out of the hole in the Pacific the way certain deep-sea things come up to the light, slow and curious and very, very large. The shape that we could not quite look at unfolded, just a little. And what unfolded was beautiful, and what unfolded was wrong, and what unfolded began, almost politely, to lower a seed at the Icarus. The pilot, a kid named Reyes, 26, who had a daughter in Pensacola and a tattoo on his wrist that said "Hold fast" in a font his grandfather had used. Reyes put the Icarus into a climb that no Icarus was rated for. The airframe screamed. The seed followed. The lullaby started. It was different here. It was louder. It was not a hush. It was a command. It came down through the fuselage and into our teeth and into the soft places behind our eyes, and I felt myself, for the first time, start to want to be still, to stop, to become music. The Veil's voice came with it through the cockpit speakers, beautiful, gentle, infinitely patient. Be still. You are becoming music. The colonel was at the EMP console. His hands were on the manual trigger because the automatic had gone gray at the edges, eaten by something that had crept up through the avionics. He looked across the bay at Nathan, and Nathan nodded once, and the colonel armed the EMP. Then the colonel looked at me. He said, "Miss Stern." I said, "Colonel." He said, "Your friend on the rig." What was the last thing he said? I told him. The colonel laughed. A real laugh. A startled one, the kind of laugh a man laughs when a joke catches him at the wrong moment. He said, "That is the most human thing I have ever heard in my life." He said, "Get in the pod, Miss Stern." I said, "Colonel." He said, "Get in the pod. Take the scientist. The trigger has to be manual. There is no version of this where I leave the trigger." You knew that getting on this plane. I had known. I had not let myself know, but I had known. Nathan was already at the pods. He had 2 of them open. He was crying, quietly, the way a man cries when he has been holding it for a long time, and finally a hand has touched his shoulder. The colonel did not touch his shoulder. The colonel said, "Instead, doctor, send the letter." Nathan sent the letter. The card went green. The laptop went green. The EMP coil went green. Somewhere in the place where the veil read, a sentence in our hand, in our margin, in our pen, arrived. "We are not an instrument. We are a writer." The colonel sang his mother's hymn. He sang it badly. He sang it loudly. He sang it with his hand on the manual trigger and his eyes on the seat above the Icarus and the lullaby in his teeth, and he sang it past the lullaby, through it, around it, the way a small, bright thing pushes through a heavy curtain. The pods launched. I saw him through the porthole for half a second. He was still singing. He was grinning, the wild grin of a man who had decided a long time ago that he would die on his feet with a tune in his mouth, and he raised the flask to me, and he tipped it, and then the EMP went, and the Icarus went, and the seat above the Icarus went, and the hole in the Pacific filled, briefly, with a light that had nothing musical about it at all. It had something else in it, something that was not a note, something that the Veil, for the first time since they had come, did not have a word for. The braided sky, all over the world, came undone. The pod hit the water hard. Nathan and I rode it down through 20 meters of dark and back up into a sea that was, suddenly and impossibly, blue again. Just blue. Ordinary, indifferent, salt-stinging blue. Above us, the clouds were clouds. The sun was a sun. A gull, somewhere, was complaining about something. A gull. I had not heard a gull in 14 weeks. I sat in the pod with Nathan's head against my shoulder and his breath uneven against my collarbone, and I looked up at a sky that had remembered, all at once, how to be a sky. And I did the thing I had not done since the gantry. I cried. I cried like a child. I cried for Eric and for the colonel, and for Reyes, who had a daughter in Pensacola, and for the waitress in Anchorage, who had dropped a plate and not picked it up. And I cried because somewhere, out beyond our small blue sky, a species that had come to compose us had just received a letter in our own handwriting, in our own margin, in our own stubborn, lamp-breaking, hymn-singing, coffee-spilling hand, and the letter had said, "No, we are not your music. We are the ones who write." The Veil did not come back the next day, or the next week, or the year after that. We do not know if we frightened them. We do not know if we offended them. We do not know if, somewhere in the dark, between stars, they are still reading Nathan's letter and trying to decide what to write back. We have built telescopes that watch for them and listening arrays that watch for the lullaby and 1,000 small ugly devices wrapped in electrical tape, because Nathan, who teaches now at a university that used to be a city, insists that the next thing they send may not be a seed. I run a small newspaper out of what is left of Anchorage. We print on paper because paper still works when nothing else does. Above my desk, in a frame Nathan made me for my 40th birthday, hangs a laminated badge with a coffee stain on it and a half-burned card that does not work anymore and never will. On the wall beside it, I have written, in a hand that is not quite steady because my hand has never been quite steady since the gantry, the only thing I know now for certain about what we are. We are the species that broke the lamp. We are the species that apologized for it at the door of the dark. And when the dark sang to us and asked us to be still and called us an instrument, we sang back, we sang badly, we sang loudly. We sang in our mother's voices, in dead Welsh hymns, in jokes about Thanksgiving lamps, in the small stubborn human noises the veil had no word for. And the dark, for now, has gone quiet. For now. I keep the flask on my desk. It is empty. I have not refilled it. Some things you do not refill. Some things you keep, exactly as they were passed to you, on a tailgate, under a failing sodium lamp, on the long road to the center of a spiral that a man's mother, once, in a kitchen in Cardiff, helped a 60-year-old colonel unmake with a hymn. That is the HFI of it, if you need the phrase. That is the human, fuck yeah. It was never the EMP. It was the hymn. It was always the hymn.